Our usual Sunday afternoon lectures, and the topic for today is intrauterine growth restriction. Topic very close to all our hearts. So you cannot beat someone who doesn't give up. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin with the topic by defining small for gestational age babies. So small for gestational age is defined as a birth weight less than the 10th percentile or less than 2 standard deviations for that gestational age. It includes constitutionally small babies, intrauterine growth restricted babies, as well as incorrectly dated pregnancies. Okay. The incidence of IUGR as per the National Neonatal and Perinatal Database of India is 9.6%. So before understanding the processes of or involved in intrauterine growth restriction, let us find out what a normal fetal growth looks like and what are the factors affecting it. So normal fetal growth is a complex process affected by several variables. This includes maternal height, maternal weight, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, genetic potential. Okay, genetic potential is what determines how big the baby will grow. This is determined by the genome, which in turn is inherited from the maternal and paternal side. Substrate supply, another important factor which determines fetal growth. This includes not only the nutrients but also oxygen supply. Fetal growth is divided into 3 phases. First 16 weeks is characterized by the phase of hyperplasia, which means there is increase in the cell number by mitotic activity. 16 to 32 weeks is characterized by a phase of hyperplasia and hypertrophy together. And after 32 weeks, it is predominantly a phase of hypertrophy, that is increase in the size of the cells. This is due to increased storage of glycogen and fats within the cells. Now, normal fetal growth rate is around 5 grams per day at 15 weeks of gestation onwards, 15 to 20 grams per day at 24 weeks of gestation, 30 to 35 grams per day at 34 weeks of gestation, and so on. So as you can see from this diagram over here, we have gestational age on the x-axis, we have growth per day in grams on the y-axis. As gestational age increases, the rate of growth also increases. Okay, so similarly, we have birth weight curves, which have been defined by a number of professional bodies, including the WHO. They have the gestational age on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, they have the estimated fetal weight. Okay. However, these birth weight curves, they will definitely identify fetuses less than the 10th percentile. For example, if at 30 weeks of gestation, if the estimated fetal weight should be around 1.8 kg, anything below the 10th percentile, if the weight lies below the 10th percentile, it will be identified. But what is the fallacy of birth weight curves? Birth weight curves fail to identify IUGR if weight as per the genetic potential is not achieved, but it is still above the 10th percentile for that gestational age. So for example, if at 36 weeks, the baby's growth potential or the genetic potential is to reach a weight of 3 kg, but the baby has reached a weight of only 2.7 kg. Though this 2.7 kg is above the 10th percentile, the baby is still growth restricted. So these birth weight curves will not be able to identify these babies. Okay. Secondly, using the birth weight curves, that is the absolute fetal weight, we may falsely misinterpret intrinsic small for gestational age babies, that is constitutionally small babies, as growth restricted babies. Okay. So how do you avoid this? Use of rate of fetal growth by serial sonographic anthropometry should be used instead. So by anthropometrical parameters, I mean the abdominal circumference, the head circumference, the biparietal diameter, the femur length. The rate of growth of these individual parameters will be normal in constitutionally small babies, but they will be restricted or they will be reduced in growth restricted babies. So that's how you can differentiate between the two. Coming to classification of intrauterine growth restriction. So we have 2 types, type 1, which is the early onset IUGR, and type 2, which is late onset IUGR. So type 1 is the symmetrical type. Type 2 is the asymmetrical type. Pathophysiology, type 1 or the early onset IUGR affects the phase of hyperplasia. So there is impaired cell division, decreased cell number, and generally it is caused by factors or causes which are irreversible. So what are these etiological factors? Congenital infections, chromosomal abnormalities, genetic disorders, and constitutionally small babies. So all these factors cause early onset of IUGR. In contrast, late onset IUGR is when there is impaired cellular hypertrophy. There is decrease in the size of the cell. Okay. Generally, the causes are reversible, and these include uteroplacental insufficiency, hypertensive disorders in pregnancy, for example, pregnancy-induced hypertension, preeclampsia, eclampsia, vasculopathies like advanced stages of diabetic vasculopathies. Clinical features include, in symmetrical IUGR, there is inadequate growth of both the head circumference as well as the abdomen. So this ratio, the head circumference is to abdominal circumference ratio, may be normal because the baby is overall restricted in size. Whereas in late onset IUGR, there is a brain sparing effect. Okay, we're going to take a look at this brain sparing effect in detail. But in short, what happens because of this uteroplacental insufficiency, the fetus undertakes compensatory mechanisms and distributes its cardiac output preferentially to the vital organs, which includes the brain. So therefore, there is a brain sparing effect, and hence the head circumference is to abdominal circumference ratio is increased in type 2 IUGR. Ponderal index, which is weight divided by length cube, is normal in early onset IUGR because their length is also reduced along with their weight. But in type 2 IUGR, the ponderal index is low because their length is normal, but the weight is reduced. Prognosis wise, poor prognosis in early onset IUGR because mainly it is due to irreversible factors, and more favorable prognosis in late onset IUGR, especially after intervention. Coming to risk factors and etiologies, there are a number of etiologies for IUGR. We will be dividing them into three, that is maternal causes, fetal causes, and placental causes. Okay. So maternal causes includes poor gestational weight gain, very important cause, constitutionally small babies, poor nutrition, social deprivation, and eating disorders, especially anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa. Fetal malformations include either chromosomal abnormalities or teratogenic effects of the drugs. Placental and cord abnormalities, these include causes such as bilobe placentation or succensurate placenta, velamentous attachment of the cord, abruptio placentae, very important cause. Maternal medical conditions, now these include your pregnancy-induced hypertension, nephropathies, diabetes mellitus in the mother, drugs and teratogens. Okay, now this lies at the intersection of maternal and fetal causes. So drugs or substance abuse such as alcohol or cocaine abuse, smoking, increased chances of IUGR as well as teratogenic drugs. Genetic abnormalities and multifetal gestation. So multifetal gestation we have seen at length in my previous lectures, and as the number of fetuses increases, there is higher chance of growth restriction because of in utero crowding. Okay. Secondly, especially in twin gestation with monochorionic placentation, because of the presence of placental vascular anastomosis, there is a higher chance of one of the babies having an IUGR, which is also called as discordant growth. Okay. And lastly, infections in the mother, especially such as cytomegalovirus, torch infections, can also give rise to growth restriction in the fetuses. So let's take a look. Fetal causes. Chromosomal abnormalities, which include trisomy 13, trisomy 18, 21, that is Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, mosaic cell lines. Structural abnormalities, especially involving the cardiovascular system, that is cyanotic heart diseases, central nervous system, genitourinary system, gastrointestinal systems, and genetic causes like phenylketonuria and galactosemia. Okay, so as you can see, Patau syndrome, very high association with intrauterine growth restriction. Similarly, even Edwards syndrome is characterized by growth restricted fetuses as compared to trisomy 21. The middle picture, you can see this is a proboscis and cyclopia, very typical of holoprosencephaly seen in Patau syndrome. Placental cord and uterine causes. Placental causes including abruption, placenta previa, chorioangioma, velamentous attachment of the cord. Single umbilical artery is another cause, especially type 3 single umbilical artery. This takes place especially in combination with certain other malformations such as genitourinary malformations. Uterine malformations and fibroids, for example, unicornuate uterus if the pregnancy lies within a unicornuate uterus, or a single horn of a didelphic uterus or bicornuate uterus. Again, due to restriction of space and alteration of the vascular supply, there could be restricted growth. Even sometimes in cases of a very large fibroid, especially cervical fibroids, which are very large, there could be restricted space, and secondly, suboptimal implantation of the placenta, giving rise to growth restriction. Maternal causes. First, maternal characteristics, which include age, parity, body mass index, and pregnancy weight gain. So that is why it is very important at every ANC visit, you must take the weight of the patient and make sure that it is on a rising trend. Uteroplacental insufficiency causes include pregnancy-induced hypertension, renal diseases, APLA syndrome, which is characterized by very severe and very early onset of hypertension. Patient may even have previous history of recurrent miscarriages. Okay. Vasculopathy due to long-standing type 1 diabetes mellitus. So diabetes mellitus is generally associated with macrosomia, but in long-standing, especially insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, there could be complications such as vasculopathy and nephropathy, which can give rise to IUGR babies. Chronic hypoxia, which includes asthma, congenital heart diseases, and respiratory diseases such as bronchiectasis. Drugs and substance abuse, so smoking, opiates, and cocaine abuse gives rise to vasoconstriction, giving rise to IUGR babies. Alcohol, warfarin, anticonvulsants such as phenytoin, especially in the first trimester if the baby is exposed, it can give rise to a number of teratogenic effects, including IUGR. So here we have fetal warfarin syndrome characterized by nasal hypoplasia, microcephaly, low birth weight, skeletal abnormalities. Fetal alcohol syndrome, again small palpebral fissure with epicanthal folds, smooth philtrum and upturned nose, cognitive and learning difficulties. And fetal Hydantoin syndrome, which is characterized by hypertelorism, flat nasal bridge, poor muscle tone, and underdeveloped toes and fingers. Okay. Infections and nutrition. Now, maternal and fetal infections such as cytomegalovirus, rubella, syphilis, toxoplasmosis, congenital malaria. All these infections are associated with fetal malformations, including deafness, cataracts, hearing disabilities, as well as with growth restriction. Nutrition of the mother and adequate gestational weight gain, again I'm emphasizing, is very important. A Cochrane database review has concluded that supplementation with iron and folic acid lowered the risk of low birth weight and small for gestational age babies. Anemia. Now, maternal anemia in most cases, especially in the milder cases of anemia, it does not restrict fetal growth. But yes, moderate to severe anemia, especially if it is long-standing, can cause restricted fetal growth. Other exceptions which can lead to IUGR are sickle cell anemia and inherited anemias like hereditary spherocytosis. Calorie requirement in singleton pregnancies where the BMI of the mother is less than 25, pre-pregnancy BMI. The daily requirement is 3000 calories per day. As the BMI increases, the caloric requirement decreases. And in twins, there is always augmented caloric requirement. So 40 to 45 kilocalories per kg per day is the daily requirement. Coming to diagnosis. Now, history is one of the most important parts of diagnosing IUGR babies. Secondly, clinical examination. And third is sonographic evaluation. Now, history of risk factors, especially history of previous IUGR, is very important because there is a 20% recurrence rate. Okay. Other factors in history should include maternal medical conditions, whether she's suffering from any comorbidities such as diabetes or nephropathy, any previous history of preeclampsia or stillbirths. So all these factors are very important for fetal surveillance in the ANC period. Determination of gestational age is of utmost importance. Using dating before 20 weeks with USG is more accurate than using last menstrual period. Okay, so this is also very important, because if you don't get the gestational age right, you may miss the diagnosis, or you may even overdiagnose growth restriction. Clinical examination. Now, clinical examination includes symphysiofundal height measurement with every ANC visit. Okay, symphysiofundal height increases by 1 centimeter per week between 14 and 32 weeks of gestation. And after 24 weeks, the fundal height in centimeters coincides with the gestational age. Variation of plus or minus 2 centimeters is accepted. Whenever there is a lag of 4 weeks in symphysiofundal height measurement and gestational age, it is considered to be moderate IUGR. A lag of 6 weeks is severe IUGR. Okay, but remember, symphysiofundal height measurement is not a very accurate method of diagnosing IUGR, though it is a good screening method for further evaluation. It has a low sensitivity, 43%, and specificity of 66%. Abdominal girth, again to be measured at the level of the umbilicus. It increases on an average by 1 inch per week after 30 weeks of gestation. It is about 30 inches at 30 weeks in averagely built women. Okay, so now this first diagram shows you abdominal palpation of the uterine fundus and where exactly it lies as gestation advances. So at 12 weeks, you can just palpate the uterine fundus above the pubic symphysis. At 16 to 18 weeks, it is midway between the umbilicus and the pubic symphysis. At 20 to 24 weeks, it is around the umbilicus. Thereafter, the region between the umbilicus and the xiphisternum is divided into 3 equal parts. The junction of the lower 1/3 and upper 2/3 is characterized by 28 weeks of gestation, followed by 32 weeks, and 36 weeks of gestation. The fundus is just maybe a finger breadth below the xiphisternum. Okay, as gestation further advances, engagement takes place. At 40 weeks, the fundal height further falls down to 32 weeks of gestation. Okay. Measurement of symphysiofundal height, remember, patient should be in supine position. The bladder should be empty. The 0 centimeter mark of the tape should be placed on the upper margin of the symphysis pubis. And you have to measure it in the longitudinal axis of the uterus after centralizing the uterus till the fundus of the uterus, that is the top of the uterus. Okay, that is how you measure it. And ideally, to avoid observer bias, the blinding method should be used. That is, the tape should be turned upside down so that there is no observer bias. You cannot see the numbers. But remember, suspicion on clinical examination has to be correlated with history and risk factors, and then additional evaluation using sonography should be done for a definitive diagnosis of growth restriction. So coming to sonography, very important in diagnosing IUGR babies and also for management of these babies. So first, fetal biometry. Biparietal diameter is generally used for determination of gestational age in the second trimester. It also helps to find out the type of IUGR, okay? Especially if it is type 2 IUGR, there is a brain sparing effect. However, low sensitivity, as brain is the last organ to be affected. So biparietal diameter has a lower sensitivity. Therefore, a better measurement parameter would be head circumference, as it is not affected by variability like in biparietal diameter. But abdominal circumference and fetal weight are the most accurate USG parameters for IUGR diagnosis. Abdominal circumference, in fact, has the highest sensitivity and greatest negative predictive value. Fetal weight can be calculated by a number of formulae, including Hadlock, Orts, or Shepherd's formula using biometric parameters. So how do you measure the abdominal circumference on ultrasound? It is a cross section or a transverse section through the abdomen at the level where the portal vein branches into its 2 branches. Okay, so it gives a typical boomerang appearance or a sickle appearance. Secondly, in this cross section, you must see or must be able to see the stomach bubble or the fundic bubble as well as the fetal spine. Okay, so this is the cross section at which you should measure the abdominal circumference, okay, for better accuracy. Now there are certain measurement ratios. These are age independent morphometric ratios which help in diagnosis of asymmetrical IUGR and differentiate it from constitutionally small fetuses. Okay, first ratio is head circumference is to abdominal circumference. Now if this ratio exceeds or is more than 2 standard deviations, it is considered to be abnormal and diagnostic of asymmetric IUGR. Why? Because the head circumference, there is a brain sparing effect. So head circumference is higher as compared to abdominal circumference. Similarly, femur length is to abdominal circumference more than 23.5% is again considered an abnormal finding and more pointing towards asymmetric IUGR. Amniotic fluid volume is the second parameter to be assessed sonographically. So oligohydramnios is usually associated with type 2 IUGR. This is due to hypoxia-induced redistribution of fetal blood flow to more vital organs with reduced renal perfusion. So when renal perfusion decreases, there is a low urine output and hence oligohydramnios. Okay, so basically oligohydramnios marks a compensatory mechanism by the fetus to adapt to decreased blood flow. So there are two methods of measuring amniotic fluid sonographically. First method, which is the better method, is single deepest vertical pocket. So you measure the single deepest vertical pocket devoid of any fetal parts or cord, and this will give you a single value in centimeters. If this value is less than 2 centimeters, it is considered to be oligohydramnios. More than 8 centimeters, it is considered to be polyhydramnios. Amniotic fluid index, on the other hand, in this single deepest vertical pocket in each uterine quadrant is measured. So you will get 4 values. The total sum of these 4 values will give you the amniotic fluid index. Okay. However, single deepest vertical pocket is a better method because AFI or amniotic fluid index will overdiagnose oligohydramnios. Now, coming to Doppler ultrasonography, essential vessels to be examined in a Doppler for IUGR include umbilical artery and the middle cerebral artery. Okay, 2 important vessels. And important arterial indices which are measured in any Doppler are pulsatility index, which is peak systolic flow minus the end diastolic flow whole divided by the mean velocity. Resistance index is the peak systolic flow minus end diastolic flow divided by the peak systolic velocity. And the SD ratio, which is corresponding to the amount of resistance in the vessel, is the systolic flow divided by the end diastolic flow. So before getting into the intricacies or nuances of the Doppler findings in a growth restricted baby, let us quickly recapitulate fetal circulation. Okay, so we have the placenta, which acts as the fetal lung. Okay, so oxygenated blood from the placenta is carried by the umbilical vein to the fetus. The umbilical vein then joins the ductus venosus, which shunts this oxygenated blood from the umbilical vein to the inferior vena cava. Inferior vena cava further goes and joins the right atrium or the right heart of the fetus. From here, the blood is then diverted to the left atrium via the foramen ovale as well as to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle on systole, there is pushing out of the blood into the pulmonary vessels, the pulmonary artery. From the pulmonary artery, the blood is shunted to the aorta by the ductus arteriosus. Okay, whenever there is a ventricular systole in the left ventricle contracts, the blood is again pushed out through the aorta, and the aorta then supplies this blood to all the body systems, the body organs. Ultimately, this mixed deoxygenated blood is carried by the umbilical arteries back to the placenta for reoxygenation, and the inferior vena cava collects all the deoxygenated blood from the body structures, the body systems, and pours it back into the right atrium, like in an adult. Okay. So this is a schematic representation of the fetal circulation to make you all better understand how Doppler changes take place in cases of IUGR with increase in the placental resistance. Okay, so quickly revising: placenta, umbilical vein carries oxygenated blood to the fetus. Oxygenated blood from umbilical vein is diverted to the inferior vena cava by the ductus venosus. Inferior vena cava takes this blood back to the right heart, right atrium to left atrium via the foramen ovale, and left ventricle. Again, the blood is pumped out into the aorta, which then goes to the body systems, including the kidneys, the brain, etc. Deoxygenated blood carried again by the umbilical arteries back to the placenta for reoxygenation. Now, what happens when there is a placental or uteroplacental insufficiency? The placental resistance increases. For example, in preeclampsia, when the placental resistance increases, normally what happens throughout the fetal cardiac cycle, whether it is systole or diastole, there is a forward flow taking place in the umbilical artery. But when the placental resistance increases, the forward flow continues in systole, but in diastole, the flow is reduced because of increased resistance in the umbilical artery. Further increased resistance in the placenta and umbilical artery, what will happen? There will be absent diastolic flow. And still further increase in resistance in the placenta and umbilical artery, so much so that this pressure exceeds the pressure of the left ventricle during diastole. What will happen? There will be a reversal of flow in the umbilical artery. So these are the chronological events taking place in the umbilical artery as far as Doppler changes are concerned. Okay. So temporal sequence of Doppler changes, which vessels are affected and in what order? First, amniotic fluid level is affected along with umbilical artery pulsatility index, followed by the middle cerebral artery velocimetry, followed by aortic Doppler changes, ductus venosus waveforms, and ultimately the IVC Doppler. Okay, so when venous changes start on Doppler examination in the fetal circulation, it is generally an advanced stage of intrauterine growth restriction. Now, coming to umbilical artery Doppler. So as we saw in IUGR, there are chronological changes in the umbilical artery. So first, there is an increase in the SD ratio because of decrease in diastolic flow. As we saw, increase in placental resistance decreases the diastolic flow, and hence this ratio increases. Okay, followed by absent end diastolic flow and reversal of end diastolic flow. So this first picture shows you the control, that is normal flow in umbilical artery Doppler. So this is the systole, the peak is the systole, the trough is depicted, the trough is depicting diastole. So increased flow in diastole, increased flow in systole, okay? When placental resistance increases, diastolic flow in the umbilical artery decreases. Further increase in resistance, absent end diastolic flow in the umbilical artery. So you can see these blank spaces between each systole. And when it rises above, when the placental resistance rises above the diastolic pressure of the left ventricle, there is a reversal of blood flow in the umbilical arteries. Okay, so these are the chronological changes which take place as placental resistance increases. Second vessel, that is middle cerebral artery. So MCA in a normal fetus has relatively little flow during diastole. So look at this first picture over here. So you can see this is systolic flow and diastolic flow at the time of this trough. Diastolic flow is very little, okay? But due to uteroplacental insufficiency, there is redistribution of blood flow to favor cerebral circulation or giving rise to the brain sparing effect. So as you can see, as umbilical artery changes start taking place due to increase in placental resistance, diastolic flow in the MCA, that is middle cerebral artery, keeps increasing. Okay, so here you can see increased flow. So when there is reversal in the umbilical artery, what happens? There is further increase in diastolic flow in the middle cerebral artery. So hence the increased flow in middle cerebral artery during diastole gives rise to reduction in the SD ratio in the middle cerebral artery. So just to revise the changes in the middle cerebral artery, MCA PI decreases in IUGR, and cerebroplacental ratio. Now this ratio is also very important. It is the ratio of the middle cerebral artery resistance index and umbilical artery resistance index. It is a more sensitive predictor to detect redistribution of blood flow in IUGR babies due to uteroplacental insufficiency. The normal value of cerebroplacental ratio is more than 1. If it is less than 1.05, it is associated with an adverse neonatal outcome. Next vessel, ductus venosus. Now this is a part of fetal circulation. If you can see this picture over here, this is the ductus venosus. It shunts oxygenated blood from the umbilical vein. So this is oxygenated blood, even though they have shown it in blue, it is oxygenated blood from the umbilical vein is shunted by the ductus venosus to the inferior vena cava before the umbilical vein can join the portal system. Okay. When circulatory compensation of the fetus fails to supply oxygenated blood to vital organs, the ductus venosus shows absent or reversed waveform during atrial contraction. Now, what happens when the compensatory measures of the fetus in response to decreased blood supply, when these measures also fail, what happens? There is decreased returning blood in the inferior vena cava. So the pressure in the inferior vena cava starts falling. When this pressure starts falling, with every right atrial contraction, there will be backflow of blood. Now, this will be reflected in the ductus venosus as either absent blood flow in the ductus venosus or reversal of the waveform. Okay. This signifies a worse perinatal outcome and is associated with abnormalities with fetal venous circulation. So whenever fetal venous circulation changes start taking place, it is associated with a worse perinatal outcome because it implies that the circulatory compensatory mechanisms of the fetus have started failing. Therefore, it should be used for surveillance in preterm SGA fetuses with abnormal umbilical artery flow, and Doppler of ductus venosus should be used to time the delivery of these preterm small for gestational age babies. This is what RCOG has recommended in their Green Top guideline number 31. Other parameters, cardiovascular parameters and evaluation of IUGR. So aortic isthmus flow pattern, abnormalities again associated with poor perinatal and neurodevelopmental outcomes. Aortic wall thickness, aortic intima media thickness ratio increased in IUGR fetuses, and myocardial performance index. So these are all new parameters. Doppler index of combined systolic and diastolic function. All these also reflect fetal compromise in cases of IUGR. However, these are not yet recommended for routine use due to lack of evidence. Coming to management of IUGR babies, most important, first confirm the diagnosis and then you determine the etiology. So once you know what the etiology is, you will know what to do for management. For example, in cases of diabetic vasculopathies or nephropathies or preeclampsia, pregnancy-induced hypertension. Okay, so the management will differ depending upon the cause. Maternal history, again, very important, especially eliciting history of comorbidities and risk factors for IUGR. Clinical examination should include a blood pressure, weight gain of the patient, symphyzofundal height, abdominal palpation. Investigations, routine investigation, that is your routine ANC profile, as well as specific investigations. Now, specific investigations include, for example, a patient suffering from nephropathy, you would want to do a renal function test. In diabetes mellitus, you will also ask for liver function test along with renal function test. In cases of Apla syndrome, for example, if she has early onset severe hypertension, history of previous recurrent miscarriages, you might want to get her tested for an Apla profile. Okay, next, predictors of IUGR. Okay, now there are certain predictors of IUGR. For example, uterine artery Doppler, generally done at 20 to 24 weeks of gestation. Increase resistance in the uterine artery or increase in the pulsatility index of uterine artery or a diastolic notching in the uterine artery is suggestive or is a predictor for future occurrence of IUGR babies. Similarly, PAP-A levels, as you would recall, we do it in the first trimester as a part of dual markers. PAP-A levels less than 0.4 multiples of median is associated with higher chances of IUGR in the pregnancy. Prevention of IUGR ideally begins before conception. So if you have the opportunity of meeting with the patient in the preconceptional period, nothing like it. Preconception counseling is very important. Optimization of maternal medical conditions such as hypertension and diabetes. Maternal medications should be revised to prevent teratogenic effects. Cessation of substance abuse, so counseling regarding stopping of smoking as well as alcohol consumption. Correction of nutritional deficiencies, especially anemia, as we saw. Anemia is associated with higher chances of intrauterine growth restriction. Early antenatal registration for accurate dating. We do not want to misdiagnose IUGR. And lastly, identify the risk factors for better antenatal surveillance. Now, which risk factors should you look for and how would you manage the patient with risk factors? RCOG has given this wonderful guideline regarding screening for small for gestational age babies depending upon the risk factors. What is the antenatal surveillance? So we have minor risk factors, we have major risk factors. Minor risk factors includes maternal age more than 35, nulliparity, history of smoking 1 to 10 cigarettes per day, mild PIH, pregnancy interval less than 6 months or more than or equal to 30 months. Major risk factors include maternal age more than 40, smoking more than or equal to 11 cigarettes per day, cocaine abuse, daily vigorous exercise, previous history of IUGR or stillbirth, maternal medical conditions such as diabetes, renal impairment, chronic hypertension, APLA syndrome, heavy bleeding in the first trimester, echogenic bowel, severe PIH preeclampsia, antepartum hemorrhage, low maternal weight gain, PAP-A less than 0.4. All these are the major risk factors. So now what they have said, if you have more than or equal to 3 minor risk factors or more than or equal to 1 major risk factors, reassess at 20 weeks for a routine fetal anomaly scan along with a uterine artery Doppler. Okay, this uterine artery Doppler, if it is normal, well and good, patient should be called for reassessment directly in the 3rd trimester at around 32 weeks. But if uterine artery Doppler is abnormal, pulsatility index is high, or if there is a diastolic notch in the uterine artery, then serial assessment of fetal size and umbilical artery Doppler should be started from 26 to 28 weeks of gestation itself. Okay. Other risk factors include abnormal Down syndrome markers, that is the soft markers for Down syndrome, or fetal echogenic bowel. If these are also present, early surveillance should be started at 26 to 28 weeks. And then in the 3rd trimester, reassessment, especially in cases of severe PIH, preeclampsia, unexplained antepartum hemorrhage. Important point, consider low dose aspirin at less than 16 weeks of gestation if there are any risk factors for preeclampsia present. Okay. And women who are unsuitable for monitoring of growth by symphyzofundal height, for example, if someone has a large uterine fibroid, then the symphyzofundal height measurement will not be accurate. In these women, subject them to serial sonographic assessment from 26 to 28 weeks onwards itself. Okay. Now, a few important points: bed rest, nutrient supplementation, oxygen therapy, plasma volume expansion, antihypertensive drugs, heparin, aspirin, all of these are ineffective measures in IUGR as stated by the American College of Obstetrics Gynecology in 2015. Low dose aspirin is recommended to be started ideally before 16 weeks in cases at risk for preeclampsia. It is not shown to be beneficial in IUGR as per the CLASP trial. Now, CLASP trial was a collaborative low-dose aspirin trial in pregnancy. And according to this trial, prophylactic low-dose aspirin is not recommended in women for prophylaxis of IUGR. L-arginine and sildenafil. Now, both of these theoretically may improve outcomes in IUGR. Why? Because L-arginine is a precursor of nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator. Sildenafil itself is a vasodilator because it is a phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor. But sufficient evidence is not available for recommending widespread use of both of these. Okay, there is no overwhelming evidence that it definitely helps in growth restricted babies. Role of corticosteroids. Now, women with small for gestational age fetus between 24 and 35 weeks, 6 days of gestation, where delivery is being considered, should definitely receive a single course of antenatal corticosteroids. That is 2 doses of betamethasone and 4 doses of dexamethasone according to RCOG Green Top guidelines. Antenatal corticosteroids reduces chances of respiratory distress syndrome, intraventricular hemorrhages, perinatal morbidity mortality, even in IUGR fetuses, especially if delivery is preterm. So as opposed to the popular belief that IUGR fetuses have accelerated lung maturation because of increased subjection to stress, it is been shown that antenatal corticosteroids still has a role to play even in these babies. Now, what if severe SGA or small for gestational age is diagnosed earlier in pregnancy, that is around 18 to 20 weeks of gestation? So what do you do then? And what are your differentials? Offer referral for a detailed fetal anomaly anatomical survey and uterine artery Doppler by a fetal medicine specialist if severe SGA is diagnosed or identified at 18 to 20 weeks of gestation. Why? Because higher chances of fetal abnormalities, malformations associated with chromosomal abnormalities. Karyotyping should be offered in severely growth restricted fetuses with structural abnormalities and in those detected before 23 weeks of gestation, especially if the uterine artery Doppler is normal. So structural abnormalities in very early gestation associated with growth restriction, uterine artery Doppler is normal, think of karyotyping because it could be associated with aneuploidies. Serological screening for congenital cytomegalovirus and toxoplasmosis infection should be offered in severely growth restricted fetuses, especially if the mother is giving a history of fever or rash earlier on in pregnancy. And now you have seen that there is severe growth restriction in the fetuses, then definitely serological screening for TORCH infections should be offered. Testing for syphilis is routinely done as a part of ANC profile, and testing for malaria also should be considered in high-risk population because congenital malaria again is associated with higher chances of growth restriction. Now, management of IUGR as per RCOG recommendations. These recommendations were given in 2013, updated last in 2014 with minor changes. So, symphysiofundal height. If you find that a single measurement of symphysiofundal height is less than the 10th centile or repeated measurements are indicative of deceleration in growth velocity, or if there is a high risk of IUGR in these fetuses, especially based on history, uterine artery Doppler or biochemistry, that is PAP-A, what will you do? Subject all these pregnancies to sonography for fetal biometry. Okay. On fetal biometry, if you find that a single reading of abdominal circumference or estimated fetal weight is less than the 10th centile, or if serial measurements indicate a deceleration in growth velocity, then you will do an umbilical artery Doppler. Now, depending on these findings of umbilical artery Doppler, if the findings are normal, well and good, repeat ultrasound fortnightly. Okay. It should include umbilical artery Doppler, MCA Doppler, abdominal circumference, and estimated fetal weight. If all these remain normal throughout, then delivery should be offered at 37 weeks of gestation. Earlier delivery should be recommended, that is after 34 weeks, if there is static growth over 3 to 4 weeks, or if MCA Doppler PI falls. Okay, and always recommend steroids if delivery is by cesarean section. Second scenario, where the umbilical artery Doppler resistance has increased. Okay, so the pulsatility index or resistance index is more than 2 standard deviations, but in the presence of a positive end diastolic flow. Okay, so end diastolic flow is still present. In such situations, repeat ultrasound weekly for abdominal circumference and estimated fetal weight, but twice a week umbilical artery Doppler should be repeated. If these findings do not deteriorate to either absent or reversed flow, if it remains a positive end diastolic flow, then delivery can be planned with intensive monitoring as per these guidelines by 37 weeks of gestation. Again, consider steroids if delivery is by cesarean section. Delivery after 34 weeks, that is earlier delivery before 37 weeks, if static growth is present over 3 weeks. Okay. And last scenario, if there is absent or reversed end diastolic flow, what do you do then? Repeat ultrasound weekly for abdominal circumference and estimated fetal weight, but a daily umbilical artery Doppler, ductus venosus Doppler, and a daily cardiotocography or NST should be done. Okay, delivery is ideally recommended by 32 weeks, but you can consider a delivery earlier, that is 30 to 32 weeks in cases even if the ductus venosus Doppler is normal. Okay, but delivery should definitely be before 32 weeks if any abnormalities in the ductus venosus Doppler arise, or if there are any abnormalities in the NST. Then you have to expedite a delivery immediately, provided that the fetus is viable. That is after 24 weeks of gestation and fetal weight more than 500 grams. Coming to labor and delivery, certain important salient features of labor and delivery. Delivery timing depends on a balance between prematurity and risk of intrauterine demise. Delivery should be conducted at well-equipped centers with intrapartum monitoring facilities and pediatrician and NICU facilities always available. These fetuses, that is IUGR fetuses, are at a higher risk of hypoxia and acidosis during labor. In small for gestational age fetuses with umbilical artery absent or reversed end diastolic flow, delivery should be by cesarean section as recommended by the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. In SGA fetuses with normal umbilical artery Doppler or with abnormal umbilical artery PI, but in the presence of end diastolic velocities, induction of labor can be offered. But remember, when you're inducing labor, there have to be facilities for intensive intrapartum monitoring, as these fetuses are at a very high risk of hypoxia, acidosis. Any sign of hypoxia or acidosis, for example, late decelerations or fetal bradycardia or decrease in the beat-to-beat variability, emergency cesarean section has to be undertaken immediately. Rates of emergency cesarean section are increased and continuous fetal heart rate monitoring is recommended from the onset of uterine contractions. Okay, so coming to our end product, that is the IUGR baby. As you can see, it has a typical old man appearance with loose, dry skin, wrinkled skin, scaphoid abdomen, protuberant ribs, very little subcutaneous fat, muscle mass is also reduced. They are also at a risk for other complications like fetal hypoxia, acidosis, especially intrapartum. Higher chances of stillbirth, especially if you are conserving the pregnancy for too long a period of time. Oligohydramnios can lead to complications like cord compression, which can cause variable decelerations. Respiratory distress syndrome, meconium aspiration, again due to acidosis. Intraventricular hemorrhage, more common in preterm IUGR babies. Hypoglycemia, hypothermia because of larger head circumference, especially in asymmetric IUGR babies. Encephalopathy because of chronic hypoxia and acidosis. Hypocalcemia, hyperviscosity syndrome. Now, chronic hypoxia gives rise to increased erythropoiesis and polycythemia. So, these babies are susceptible to hyperviscosity syndrome, which can give rise to thrombosis as well, and lower neurodevelopmental scores in these babies. Now, there's something called as a Barker's hypothesis. Now, David Barker was a British epidemiologist, and he proposed that adverse nutrition in early life, including prenatal, as seen in small for gestational age babies, increases the susceptibility to the metabolic syndrome. So this is called as fetal origin of adult diseases. And as per this hypothesis, these small for gestational age babies or low birth weight babies are at a risk of diabetes, obesity, chronic hypertension, hyperlipidemia, as well as complications like coronary artery diseases and stroke later on in life. A number of studies after this hypothesis have been undertaken, and most of them have found this hypothesis to be true, though large-scale studies are still awaited to formulate certain management interventions to prevent this sequelae in these babies. And lastly, just to sum up the entire topic, we have the difference between preterm babies and IUGR babies. Okay, so preterm babies, remember, their weight is appropriate for gestational age, whereas IUGR babies are small for gestational age. Length is less in preterm babies, usually less than 44 centimeters. Here the length is unaffected. Head and abdomen are relatively large in preterm babies, but in IUGR babies, the head circumference is more than the abdominal circumference, especially in type 2 IUGR because of the brain sparing effect. Now the skin in preterm babies is thin, red, shiny, reduced subcutaneous fat. In IUGR babies, it is dry, wrinkled skin, less subcutaneous fat, giving a typical old man appearance. Preterm babies are generally covered with plentiful lanugo and vernix caseosa, whereas IUGR babies are covered with meconium, especially if they have been subjected to intrapartum distress, and meconium stained vernix caseosa with a very thin, fragile umbilical cord. Ear pinna, soft and flat in preterm babies, fingernails not grown up to fingertips. In IUGR babies, ear pinna cartilaginous and cartilaginous creases are also present. Fingernails are long and grown up to the tips or even further than the tips in some cases. Plantar deep creases are not visible in preterm babies. Deep plantar creases are well defined in IUGR babies, which are not preterm. Poor muscle tone, closed eyes and weak cry in preterm babies, whereas IUGR babies, the babies are alert, active with a normal cry and eyes are generally open. Poor reflexes seen in preterm babies and reflexes in IUGR babies are normal. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for your patient listening. Just to wrap up, we have the take-home message. Preconception counseling and screening with risk factors helps in prevention and early diagnosis of IUGR. Fetal surveillance should include serial biometry, amniotic fluid assessment, Doppler studies, biophysical profile, and CTG. Delivery timing depends on balance between prematurity and risk of intrauterine demise. Continuous intrapartum fetal heart monitoring is important as they are at a high risk of hypoxia and acidosis and therefore higher incidence of cesarean section in IUGR fetuses. Delivery should be at a well-equipped center with a pediatrician and neonatologist always available for immediate neonatal care. Okay, so that was it with